You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
Many of us start our day by scrolling through the headlines, from nutrition tips to alarming public health stats. It can feel like there's an overwhelming amount of health news. Our phones offer us a constant stream of stories, which raise so many more questions than answers. Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Dr. Manesh Patel. I'm the head of cardiology at Duke Medicine and faculty member at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. I'm joined today by my co-host and colleague, Dr. Emily O'Brien, a population health researcher at the DCRI.
Thanks, Manesh. This episode also kicks off Beyond the Headlines for our second season of Beyond the Endpoint. And honestly, this is a great way to kick it off because there have been many headlines that have caught my eye this summer, both in the population health and the research space. So I think maybe, we could just kick it off with the elephant in the room. This is, the topic that you and I have been, thinking about really all day, every day, I think is fair to say, since January. And that is the discussion around federal funding for research. So, of course, we're researchers. This pays some of our salary and certainly the salaries of the folks that we work with every day. And even if we are, insiders, so to speak, hopefully we can shed light on maybe some of the misconceptions that we've seen and kind of give the perspective of people who are working in this space about, why we think this funding is so important and how it kind of connects to everyday decisions that people make about their health and that their doctors make when they go to a doctor's office or a clinic to get care.
Yeah, I think it's a great topic. And obviously, a lot of people have been trying to discuss it and understand it even more. I find that when we talk about funding for research, sometimes just thinking about how do you fund anything, right? And so to conduct clinical research or just research in general, we have to have infrastructure. That sometimes includes labs, clinics, staff, technology. You can imagine all kinds of things that are needed to achieve the work to ultimately, hopefully, leads to those things that improves health. We often partner to try to fund this research, whether it's the NIH, the government, or industry sponsors, but we have infrastructure that it's sort of our duty to make sure we support and long-term get this research to come fruition. And the impact to the bottom line is often uncertain. And so when the costs are getting more and more expensive to do everything, I think it is fair to say, what do you get for that investment? And how does that investment lead to outcome? And I guess that's the first question maybe we should tackle, which is federal funding really is the engine that makes research around the country available. So maybe the first thing, Emily, for us to talk about is just how important funding for research is.
Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a moving statistic. And so actually it was, I think, an interesting time for all of us to kind of get caught up on how important NIH funding is for medical research. And, in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, we've sort of taken for granted that the US is part of this group of like world leaders in science, right? And I think we can maybe lose sight of like how we got there. And the truth is we got there from investments from taxpayers, right? And we're able to really do rigorous work that at the time may have even felt a little bit risky, certainly, bigger, more organized efforts than we'd seen before. But then, we see breakthroughs that we can tie to that investment. And where we've sort of landed now is that the NIH is funding about half of all medical research in the US. So a super, large proportion. As you've mentioned, it's important to ask us, like, what does that investment get us? The other side of it that can sort of get lost in the discussion is like, well, let's say that we did reduce that by quite a bit and we made it, just a much smaller proportion of all funding. Think about the other big funder that you mentioned, which is industry. And, we do a lot of partnerships with industry, and I think those can be done really well. But they have different motivations, right? I mean, they're funding science, certainly with some population health motivation, but they really are also, answering to shareholders. And so if that's the only engine that drives what gets studied, it is almost guaranteed that less profitable conditions or less profitable questions really are going to be asked and answered. And it doesn't mean that industry is studying the wrong things. It just means that really the drivers look a little bit different than they look when we take a full population health perspective. And so I think the combination that you mentioned, can be healthy, has been healthy. And I do think it's an important conversation to ask, okay, well, are we investing in the right things? which is where a lot of the conversation has gone these days. And of course, that depends on your values, and we're all going to, have different values that we bring to the table. But even though we're not happy that some of the areas that have been cut have been sort of the target of this administration, I think the conversation is a good one to have, right? Like, what really should be our biggest areas of investment? And I don't know if you've had that sort of conversation with others and with maybe in your own mind about like, okay, well, like, let's take a step back and sort of ask what our values are and where we should be focusing. And I don't know if that's changed at all for you over the past 8 or 9 months, but I know it's been something we've all talked about.
I'll just start by saying, I think it's a good exercise to continually force yourself to say, what are we spending our money on? So I don't have any issues with that. In fact, I think it's a needed conversation. We can all imagine that there are no perfect organizations or perfect ways of doing this. We do it in our own household. We sit every now and then and go, are we spending on the right things? What are our values? Is it kids' education? Is it these things we care about? What are you going to spend your money on, right? And so those are the kinds of things I think we all think about. And I think what you just highlighted is really important, which is if you think about research, there are two big pathways. One is to just go down where there's a big need. You could think about chronic conditions. I'm in cardiovascular disease. We want to absolutely make the country and the world healthier. And you could imagine thinking about chronic diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol, et cetera. But to your point, there are kids with cancer. There are people with unusual conditions that also need research done because they make a big difference in the immunologic therapy or the cancer therapies that don't always get studied. And finally, there's research just to discover things that you don't know where it's going to go. Like when they're studying the venom of a snake that turns out to be a blood thinner that helps people with heart attacks. So sometimes we're learning things that we don't know will have a direct impact. And that, in fact, is some of which the biggest discoveries happen. So the only thing I get back to is that you got to have the best smart people you have reviewing these. And traditionally, the NIH or the companies are using their best resources to say, what are these ideas that we think are best in class that should be funded? So the first sort of message for me in thinking about funding of research is the United States has been separately seen because we have been an engine. Now, I absolutely think it's very fair to say if we're an engine of that research and innovation, we should also be an engine of getting benefits of that at a better price and opportunity to the patients and the people in our country that need it most. So I don't want these things to be disassociated. Absolutely, we have to think about how we spend our money for research. And absolutely, we should negotiate ways to get those therapies to our patients and our communities. Those are really important messages. What's been complicated is there's this whole belief system that there's a lot of other resources to do this work. And I think that is maybe what people don't always understand. It's a little bit akin to saying, well, we're going to pay for you to build the car, but we're not going to pay for the factory. We want you to go do the work. We want you to do the research, but we don't see any effort in actually understanding how to build a factory to do that. And that's part of what I'll call the research infrastructure at much of the places that need it around the country.
Yeah. The other misconception that I've heard a lot of discussion about is the concept of these endowments. So you see these like crazy numbers. I don't even know, like it, at some point you just like can't even process like the numbers because universities do have big endowments and the perception is like, well, you have this money, just use your own money basically to fund this stuff. And I think what has gotten lost is this really the set of legal restrictions on those endowment funds. So I think something like 90% of endowment funds are legally restricted to things like scholarships or like specific buildings. You can't just like use a gift for a cancer building to fund your Alzheimer's research because you got your grant cut for Alzheimer's research. It's just not the way that it works. So it would be great if we had access to this big pot of money as scientists to pay for, keep our labs going and pay for our project managers and data collection, but it's just not an option. And so that's an important nuance, I think, that can get lost.
We all want the same thing, which is, I'll just say for us, we want a healthier North Carolina. And I want to partner with my colleagues at the other universities that are across the state. And unfortunately, right now for health, we have not been able to get these discoveries as close to our patients as possible. And when people think about the funding of these, and I understand there are tough times going on because all of us are facing financial uncertainty, the endowments, unfortunately, are already accounted for by people who use their funds to appropriate it the way they wanted to, hopefully to the good of not just that institution, but any institution. So in some ways, I think about it as an important conversation, but a bigger conversation is how do you make this sustainable? How do we fund research and find a way in which we can demonstrate that that research is improving human health and there's that value that the taxpayer feels and we should feel as taxpayers, just like we think about other spending that may happen in our houses or in the country. And so one of the real important conversations for us, I think internally and for people listening to this is, our goal here is to get this research closer to you so you see how it touches your life and how it touches the health of your family. Because when we think of esoteric things, sometimes like, oh my gosh, who cares about whether or not lithium is associated with this problem or not? Or who cares about whether or not the paint on the wall might do this? It's those human health discoveries that made our kids a little healthier or made the people walking around a little safer. And so, in part, I think we have to tell those stories to show people the value of the funding for our research.
Yeah, I mean, two other things I sort of think about in this conversation about value is that we know that those investments that we've pointed to have been successful in many ways, right? So you look at the top 25 drugs in the past 25 years, most of those were built in some way on federally funded research. So that sounds like pretty big and quantifiable impact. But it's not just health, right? So there have been economic analyses of NIH funding and how it affects local economies. And the best estimate is that for every dollar in NIH funding, we see about $2.60 in economic activity. And so the population health perspective is one part of it. But I think it's also really important to sort of think about the community impacts and the economic impacts of this spending, which are also on the plus side.
Yeah, I'll just make one more comment and then we get into some headlines. If you have a heart attack right now in the United States, we tell EMS to give you an aspirin based on a variety of research that was in part funded by the NIH. We take you to the closest hospital to have resuscitation, which was funded in part by both NIH and American Heart Association research. All the therapeutics discovered or identified through in part NIH funding. So when somebody has a heart attack and they live longer than they did in the time of FDR, it is because we invested in the research to make sure people don't have the same outcomes that people did when they had these heart attacks. And so I think sometimes from high school education or even elementary school education of AEDs and CPR to the resuscitation chain to the work that both NIH and AHA and others are doing, I think sometimes is lost. It may not be lost, maybe just not front of mind. And so I know that for us to think about it again, as we think about healthy schools and healthy communities, is just going to be another important one.
This is Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast where we bring personal and expert perspectives on healthcare and clinical research to the casual listener. Stay tuned after the interview for a breakdown with the hosts. They'll talk through key takeaways and what this week's topic means for you.
We wanted to spend a little time with everyone just to make sure we address I'll call it the elephant in the room, which is how do we keep supporting and improving not just the delivery of healthcare, which is critical, but the discovery of it so that we can make that loop a little shorter for people's health. And with that, maybe we get into headlines over the last few weeks. I don't know, Emily, if you had one that caught your eye.
Oh, yeah, I have one. You may have heard that there's been some discussion about vaccines and safety and impact on neurodevelopmental outcomes. So there's one big study that's been in the news that I just wanted to talk about that I think there's some really interesting sort of policy pieces to this too. So I think as you've probably seen, groups that have questioned the safety of vaccines have pointed historically to several ingredients, and one of them is aluminum. So as you also know, aluminum salts, they've been used in vaccines for about 7 decades to help them work better, right? And so there have been smaller studies that have said, well, like maybe there's some associations with adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes, things like asthma, allergies, autism, et cetera. And so there's a huge study in Denmark that was just published by a group at the Statens Serum Institute. Over 1 million kids, so 1.2 million kids born between 1997 and 2018, and they followed them up to age 5 and looked at their vaccine exposure. And one of the interesting things about Denmark is that they don't have a lot of unvaccinated kids. So they didn't have like a clean control group, which is, typically what we're looking for when we're looking for data on safety and effectiveness. But because most of the population is vaccinated, they couldn't look at a completely unvaccinated group. So what they did is look at this sort of dose comparison approach. So essentially what they did was take advantage of a change in the vaccine schedule. So really long period, 25 years of data. And over time, there were some new vaccines added that contained aluminum. So they said, all right, if you got vaccinated early, you might have had a certain level of aluminum exposure. If you got vaccinated later, your aluminum exposure increased because there were more shots that contained aluminum. So they said, okay, well, this is our exposure, and we're going to see if outcomes differ across these groups. Because if aluminum really caused problems, you'd expect the kids who had more aluminum in the shots to have higher rates of disease. But in this case, they actually found no differences at all in neurodevelopmental outcomes by aluminum dose. And so this is just another study in the growing evidence base to show that vaccine ingredients and vaccines themselves are not associated with increased risk of autism. They also found no associations with other conditions like asthma. And so the sort of bottom line take home from Anders Vid, who's the lead author, is that there's no epidemic of childhood disease that's linked to aluminum in vaccines.
Yeah, it's really valuable to at least have a data set like those in Denmark or some parts of the world where they have such complete ascertainment. They recently also published some really interesting data on screening and a variety of outcomes. So I actually think even when there's a topic like vaccines, which there's such interest in importantly, and then there's chronic health, Denmark is valuable to us in the sense that they're doing these large hundreds of thousands of people population studies that give us this insight, as you've highlighted. One thing I'll just sort of mention as we go from this important study is that there's always this conversation we have in Beyond the Endpoint between association and causation. When is something associated with something versus something causing something? Here, there's an elegant sort of analysis on saying when there wasn't something and now there is something added, do we see some difference? Another study in the last few weeks that sort of made me think about this was a study in Medical News Today, I think in August, where poor sleep was linked to 172 diseases, including dementia, Parkinson's disease, and diabetes. The strength of the study is a very large data set and a lot of analysis looking at people who have poor sleep and these disorders. But truly, as one of the commentators there said, we know sleep is important for health, but the problem of teasing out whether that sleep is related to those disorders versus those disorders being the reason people aren't sleeping well is hard to know. And so sometimes when we're collecting data and making these observations, we're trying to decide, is this linkage something that causes a problem, or is this just an associated problem that happens? And so for at least this article, I thought it was another example of something that we see all the time where there's no way someone can tell you that there's 100% confidence that this sleep disorder is tied to your underlying health versus the underlying health condition leading to it. But we know that there's no harm in saying getting better sleep is good, and we know that the body needs it. So, at least I took from that story the importance of good sleep. And I do think this is an important sort of lesson in causation versus this is much more association than causation and gets us back to some of those principles that you talk a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, epidemiology is messy, right? And that's part of why we like it. It's interesting, it's complex. And as we start to think about these exposures that are, more sort of multi-layered, think about some really important studies from the 50s where we first started to see how things like cigarette smoking were harmful for health. That was pretty straightforward exposure. You think about something like sleep, there's all sorts of variables in there, the duration, whether you're splitting it up into biphasic sleep versus, just all in one shot, other things that can affect both sleep and outcomes. One thing that I like to kind of come back to is something that one of my mentors, Kevin Weinfurt, once said. What we're really doing is trying to reduce uncertainty with every study. Not every study is going to be the one study that says we know this thing for sure, but we're watching the body of evidence and hopefully focusing on the well-done research within that body of evidence so that we can get closer and closer to the truth with time. Also, just add that we do, unfortunately, have a new natural experiment that's going to be coming up for all of us, given that some states, well, one in particular, Florida, is actually getting rid of their vaccine mandates for schools for several vaccines, chickenpox, Hep B, pneumococcal infections. And so this will be a natural experiment, right? We'll see what happens to vaccination rates. We'll see what happens to infection rates. And we'll see what happens to the rates of some of the conditions that I think some folks have kind of pointed to as areas of concern, like asthma, allergies, autism, and be able to see what happens. Do those go up or down after this kind of policy change? And so that'll be another one that we'll keep an eye on and probably talk about again in the future.
No, for sure. The only other one that I was interested in, I'll just say because I use it too, is something called open evidence. And there's a story in Forbes about how a Harvard PhD started open evidence and is, turning it into a very big business. And it's an interesting story because I think it is important to understand where clinicians and physicians are getting their information. Open evidence was started by Daniel Nadler, and he's a PhD from Harvard and had already been doing some biotech startups. And in 2022, started a company as ChatGPT came out saying, hey, how do you put all the information in a way that clinicians and physicians might use in real time? And interestingly, got agreement with New England Journal, JAMA, and others to get the citations and the full papers into a system to where just like you might do a Google search, clinicians and physicians could get it. Now, the trick, which was really smart, is that it's free access with your email and sign in to physicians and clinicians around the country. And now they have something like 40% of the people signed up. And it is really valuable, I find it, to be able to free text put a question in about so and so with these problems. What do you think? And it gives you a summary based on ChatGPT with the link to the evidence. You still can go read it. You can go look at the guidelines, especially when it's not in your field of interest or something that's sort of adjacent. So I see this as just the first of many of what I'll call tools to make our practice and interaction better. I hope that they become more patient facing too, so that people can look at the primary data like a lot of people say they want to. I think that's really valuable. But I do think there's value in at least starting it in a way in which people can interact with it I'll call it a very user-friendly way. And I can tell you that it is a tool that is quite user-friendly and quite immediate. And so I think it'll only grow. The question for me in our practice will be more of these clinical decision support tools will be coming. And I've said on this before that I think there'll need to be not I don't even say regulation. There'll need to be where does truth lie, which is often complicated to solve. And so here it's easier because we're just providing people with the references. But as we get closer and closer to recommendations to say, oh, for this person, you should think about this or that, we'll have to continue to work on where the tools and the humans interact to keep the human in the loop, if you will.
Hey, so I'm so interested in this topic, and I know we could probably do a whole episode on this, but I'm curious how you think this should connect to medical training. Do you think it should be discouraged when people are in the early stages of learning how to develop clinical judgment and apply it? Or you think this is an important tool that every med student should be learning how to use?
I think it's an important tool every med student should be learning how to use because Gene Stead and sometimes Rob Califf, who's been on here before, said, if you think you've had a new thought, somebody's had it before. He said in the 60s as he was starting the PA school and then the internet came, he said, we hold like knowledge to be some sort of sacred cow that we study and memorize and have to call up. But soon enough with the internet and data accessibility, that information will be available. The skill and art in medicine isn't getting the knowledge, it's applying it contextually to the person in front of you. So you do have to have some training to understand biologic pathways or scientific evidence. But then getting the information is going to get easier and easier. Applying the information appropriately is going to get harder and harder. And in fact, that's what I would say is what medicine should continue to be about. And the human part of medicine, which is the most fun part, interacting with people to give them confidence or understanding of that information is probably, hopefully, where most people get the joy. So I think open evidence, like any other tool, whether we try to fight it or not, should be immediately available, and our clinicians should be teaching to it. I often say to our own team, AI is not going to replace clinicians or physicians, but physicians who don't use AI will be replaced by physicians who do use AI. And so just like any other tool, learning how to use it and apply it for the betterment of your patients is going to be really important.
I guess the other piece of it on the research side is if you did all of this as a human and you wanted to publish an evidence summary, we call that a systematic review or meta-analysis. And if you want to get it into a journal, you're going to have to go through peer review. Do you think peer review has some place here and that scientists should have some oversight of these evidence summaries, or does that lie at the feet of the clinician who's using these tools?
Right now, I think most of the things they're referencing are peer-reviewed or at least potentially peer-reviewed. So that's one helpful thing. The engine is reading peer-reviewed literature and citing it for you and showing you where it is. So you still have to do it. So I consider it more like a really fancy organizing folder. Like instead of me having to go do the search and find all of it, it's doing it in a really valuable, fast way. At some point, I think you're right that peer review itself of saying new information, or like that's where I get to clinical decision support or recommendation. That's where we're going to really need peer-to-peer interaction. I think it'll be really valuable. Well, this has been a really great conversation. I'm thinking, Emily, across all kinds of headlines. The last one might be the biggest because we talked a lot about funding and uncertainty with information. But as we think about how more and more information is put together, I hope that that's the future where we can get to where enough information with enough peers gets us to where we can actually get to information that is as close to representing what we want as possible. Of course, there's a downside, and that downside might be people worried that it's going to be misinformation or disinformation if it's not appropriately used. So I do think that'll be an important part. Were there other take-homes that you have?
I've just been thinking that this is a really interesting and exciting time to be connected to the scientific community and seeing, all the progress with new technologies and with AI, and at the same time, seeing a lot of the challenges that are coming up around trust and transparency. And I think that's going to be the most important part of the way that we train the next generation of scientists is to really understand those challenges and to realize that we could do the best possible science. And if people don't trust what we're saying, and if they have doubts about the way that data are generated, that, we're fighting a really losing battle. And so I hope that a lot of the discussions that are happening now that feel heated, in some ways, if we can continue to have those and continue to talk with one another and really be disciplined about sharing how evidence is generated and kind of demystifying, I think we'll be in a much healthier place going forward and be able to really leverage these technologies for all the ways they can benefit clinical care.
I would say the same. I think, look, with great opportunity to make the world a healthier and better place comes great responsibility. And I strongly believe that these tools, the research, getting closer to our colleagues, our patients, our communities will only make this better. Again, when we're in a room having civil discourse with each other or any other groups, we, I think, get to a better place with all the different views to help our health and our communities with research, bringing health to them. So I'm excited for that. I'm excited for our second season. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Beyond the Headlines, a recurring series here on the podcast. We encourage you to share any headlines that have caught your eye by emailing us at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu.
And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Amazon Music, or Apple Podcasts. You can also connect with the Duke Clinical Research Institute on LinkedIn or by following DCRI News on X and Blue Sky. We hope you join us for our next episode.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.